In 1982, during a concert in Iowa, Ozzy Osbourne picked up what he thought was a rubber toy thrown from the crowd. Without thinking, he bit into it. The audience screamed. It wasn't a toy. It was a real bat. Blood filled his mouth as thousands of fans watched in shock. Within hours, Ozzy was rushed to the hospital for rabies shots, and the story exploded across newspapers around the world. Critics called him insane. Some said his career was over, but the truth was far stranger. By that moment, Ozzy had already survived years of addiction, being fired from Black Sabbath in 1979, and a life that repeatedly pushed him to the edge of collapse. Yet somehow he kept coming back. By the time the bat incident shocked the world in 1982, Ozzy Osbourne was already living a life that sounded almost impossible to believe. Just 3 years earlier, in 1979, he had been fired from Black Sabbath, the very band that helped invent heavy metal. Years of cocaine, alcohol, and chaos had pushed him so far out of control that even his own bandmates believed he was finished. For many in the industry, Ozzy was not a comeback story waiting to happen. He was a warning about what rock and roll could destroy. But the next chapter of his life became one of the strangest turnarounds in music history. In 1980, Ozzy released his first solo album, Blizzard of Ozz, and the record exploded. Songs like Crazy Train quickly became anthems of a new generation of metal fans. Instead of fading away, Ozzy suddenly looked bigger than ever. The man many thought would disappear after being fired from Black Sabbath was now selling millions of records on his own, and the chaos never stopped. Throughout the 1980s, Ozzy built a reputation as the most unpredictable figure in rock music. On stage, he shocked audiences with outrageous behavior. Off stage, he fought constant battles with addiction and self-destruction. Yet somehow, the music kept working, the tours kept selling out, and the legend kept growing. Over the next decades, Ozzy Osbourne would sell more than 100 million records, influence generations of metal bands, and earn the title fans still use today, the Prince of Darkness. But behind that legend was a life that repeatedly hovered on the edge of collapse. Ozzy Osbourne was born John Michael Osbourne in 1948 in the industrial city of Birmingham, England. At the time, Birmingham was not the birthplace of rock stars. It was a city of factories, steel, smoke, and endless rows of working-class houses. The air often smelled of metal and coal dust, and most families lived from paycheck to paycheck. Ozzy grew up in a small home with 6 children, sharing cramped space and very little privacy. His father worked long shifts as a toolmaker, while his mother took multiple jobs to keep the household running. Life was stable enough to survive, but never comfortable. From an early age, Ozzy struggled in school. He suffered from severe dyslexia, though the condition was not widely understood at the time. Teachers often labeled him lazy or slow because he had trouble reading and concentrating. School became a place where he felt constantly embarrassed and misunderstood. Classmates frequently bullied him, and Ozzy later admitted that he spent much of his childhood feeling like an outsider who simply didn't fit anywhere. By the time he turned 15, Ozzy left school completely. Like many teenagers in Birmingham, he entered the industrial workforce. His early jobs included work at a construction site, tuning car horns at a factory, and even working briefly at a slaughterhouse. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and offered little hope for a different future. For a young man already struggling with confidence, those years felt like a trap. During this period, Ozzy also drifted into trouble. In his late teens, he became involved in petty theft, attempting small burglaries with friends. Eventually, he was caught by police and spent several weeks in prison. His father refused to pay the fine that could have secured his early release, forcing Ozzy to stay in jail longer than expected. That experience left a lasting mark on him. For the first time, he realized how easily his life could slide into something far darker. Around the same time, something unexpected changed his direction. Ozzy discovered the music of the Beatles. Hearing their songs was a revelation. For a working-class teenager in a gray industrial city, the idea that ordinary boys from Liverpool could become global stars felt almost unbelievable. Ozzy later said that moment gave him his first real dream, the possibility that music could be an escape. After leaving prison, he began singing in small local bands around Birmingham. The early performances were rough and unpolished, but they gave him something he had never truly felt before: confidence. On stage, the shy and insecure teenager disappeared. In his place stood a performer with a powerful voice and a strange charisma that audiences remembered. During the late 1960s, Ozzy met guitarist Tony Iommi, bassist Geezer Butler, and drummer Bill Ward. All of them came from similar working-class backgrounds and shared the same frustration with ordinary life in Birmingham. Together, they began experimenting with a darker, heavier sound than most rock bands at the time. That collaboration would soon evolve into a band that changed music forever: Black Sabbath. And with that band, Ozzy Osbourne would begin the long and chaotic journey toward becoming one of the most infamous figures in rock history. By the late 1960s, Birmingham was still a city of factories and steel, but something new was starting to grow beneath the industrial noise. A group of young musicians from working-class neighborhoods were searching for a different kind of sound, something darker, heavier, and more honest than the psychedelic rock dominating the charts. One of those young men was Tony Iommi, a guitarist who had already experienced a life-changing accident. While working in a metal factory, Iommi lost the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand in an industrial machine. Doctors told him he might never play guitar again. Instead of giving up, he modified his instrument and developed a darker, heavier style of playing that would later become the foundation of heavy metal. Around the same time, Ozzy Osbourne was still drifting between small local bands in Birmingham. He had talent, but very little direction. One day, he placed a simple advertisement in a local music shop window: "Ozzy Zig needs gig." The ad caught the attention of Tony Iommi, bassist Geezer Butler, and drummer Bill Ward. The 4 musicians already knew each other loosely from the Birmingham music scene, and soon they began rehearsing together. At first, the group played blues-based rock, similar to many bands of that era. They performed under several early names, including Polka Tot Blues Band and later Earth. But something about their music felt different. The industrial environment of Birmingham, the dark atmosphere of the factories, and frustrations of working-class life began to shape their sound. Geezer Butler, who was deeply interested in horror films and occult imagery, suggested experimenting with darker themes in their music. Around this time, Butler wrote lyrics inspired by a frightening experience involving what he believed was a supernatural presence in his room. The band turned that story into a slow, ominous song built around Tony Iommi's heavy guitar riff. The song was called Black Sabbath. When audiences heard it for the first time, the reaction was immediate. The music sounded nothing like the cheerful pop songs of the time. It was slow, heavy, and unsettling. The band realized they had stumbled onto something new. Soon they adopted the name Black Sabbath for the band itself. In 1970, they released their debut album, Black Sabbath. Critics initially dismissed it, calling the music crude and repetitive, but fans responded differently. The album climbed the charts in both the United Kingdom and the United States. Suddenly, the band from industrial Birmingham was attracting international attention. Later that same year, they released their second album, Paranoid. The record would become one of the most important albums in the history of heavy music. Songs like Paranoid, Iron Man, and War Pigs became defining tracks for an entire generation of rock fans. For Ozzy Osbourne, the transformation was dramatic. Only a few years earlier, he had been a factory worker and part-time criminal struggling to survive in Birmingham. Now he was standing on stage in front of thousands of screaming fans. But success came with a price. The band began touring constantly across Europe and the United States. Long tours meant exhaustion, pressure, and unlimited access to alcohol and drugs. What started as occasional partying quickly turned into something much heavier. Cocaine, in particular, became a constant presence around the band. Despite the chaos, Black Sabbath continued releasing successful albums throughout the early 1970s, including Master of Reality, Volume 4, and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Each record strengthened their reputation as the darkest and heaviest band in rock music. Ozzy's voice became one of the most recognizable sounds in the genre. His strange mix of haunting melody and raw energy perfectly matched the heavy riffs created by Tony Iommi. By the mid-1970s, Black Sabbath had become one of the biggest rock bands in the world. But behind the fame, the pressure was beginning to take its toll. Drug use inside the band grew heavier with every album. Arguments between members became more frequent. Creative tension slowly turned into personal conflict. And Ozzy, the unpredictable frontman who had once been a heart of the band, was gradually losing control of his own life. By the end of the decade, the same band that had lifted Ozzy out of poverty would make a decision that shocked the entire rock world. In 1979, Black Sabbath fired Ozzy Osbourne. For many people watching from the outside, it looked like the end of the story. But in reality, the most chaotic chapter of Ozzy's life was only beginning. When Black Sabbath fired Ozzy Osbourne in 1979, most people in the music industry believed his career was finished. Years of alcohol and drug abuse had turned him into an unpredictable liability, and many record labels quietly assumed that Ozzy would fade away like many other rock stars of the 1970s. Even Ozzy himself believed it. For a period after the split, he spent weeks drinking heavily and isolating himself, convinced that the band had taken the only identity he had ever known. But behind the scenes, one person refused to let the story end that way. Sharon Arden, the daughter of Ozzy's former manager Don Arden, stepped forward and took control of his future. Sharon believed that Ozzy still had something the music world could not easily replace, a voice that had already helped shape heavy metal. She convinced him to rebuild his career from the ground up as a solo artist. At the time, it was a risky decision. Ozzy was unstable, unreliable, and widely viewed as a fading rock singer from a band that had already peaked. Yet Sharon pushed forward. One of the most important steps in rebuilding Ozzy's career came with the discovery of a young American guitarist named Randy Rhoads. Rhoads was only in his early 20s, but his style was unlike anything Ozzy had worked with before. While Tony Iommi's riffs had defined the dark sound of Black Sabbath, Randy Rhoads brought something new, a combination of classical influence, technical precision, and explosive energy. Together, they began writing the material that would become Ozzy's first solo album. In 1980, the album Blizzard of Ozz was released. Almost immediately, it proved the critics wrong. The record featured one of the most recognizable guitar intros in rock history, Crazy Train. The song quickly became an anthem, capturing both Ozzy's chaotic reputation and his strange ability to connect with audiences. Another track, Mr. Crowley, further showcased Randy Rhoads' extraordinary guitar work and helped establish Ozzy's new identity as a solo artist. Instead of disappearing after being fired from Black Sabbath, Ozzy suddenly seemed larger than ever. The album sold millions of copies worldwide. Tour dates began selling out across Europe and North America. Fans who had followed him through the Sabbath years were eager to see what the new chapter would bring, and younger audiences discovered him for the first time through his solo music. Ozzy Osbourne was no longer just a former singer of Black Sabbath. He had become a rock star again, this time on his own terms. Yet the success came with intense pressure. Touring schedules became relentless, and Ozzy's lifestyle remained chaotic. Alcohol and drugs were still constant companions, and the atmosphere around the band often felt unpredictable. But as long as the music kept working and the crowds kept growing, the momentum continued. Then in 1982, tragedy struck. While the band was on tour in the United States, Randy Rhoads was killed in a shocking accident. A small plane carrying Rhoads and two others crashed after performing dangerous low passes near the band's tour bus. The crash killed everyone on board. For Ozzy, the loss was devastating. Randy Rhoads had not only been a brilliant guitarist, he had also been a stabilizing presence during Ozzy's fragile comeback. Without him, Ozzy felt as if the foundation of his new career had suddenly disappeared. But the machine of fame rarely stops moving. Despite the tragedy, Ozzy continued touring and recording new music. His reputation grew even larger as stories about his unpredictable behavior spread through the press. Incidents like the infamous 1982 bat-biting moment during a concert in Iowa turned him into a headline around the world. To critics, Ozzy looked like the most chaotic figure in rock music. To fans, he was something else entirely. He was becoming a legend. By the mid-1980s, Ozzy Osbourne had firmly reestablished himself as one of the most powerful figures in heavy metal. His albums continued to sell, his concerts continued to fill arenas, and his name had become synonymous with the wild, rebellious spirit of rock. The man who had once been fired from his own band was now standing at the center of an expanding global fan base. But behind the roaring crowds and the explosive guitar solos, Ozzy's life was still drifting dangerously close to collapse, and the darkest battles were still waiting ahead. By the mid-1980s, Ozzy Osbourne looked unstoppable from the outside. His solo albums were selling millions of copies. Arenas across the United States and Europe were filled with fans screaming his name, and the media had already crowned him with a nickname that seemed to define his image perfectly: the Prince of Darkness. But behind the spectacle of sold-out tours and explosive guitar riffs, Ozzy's private life was moving deeper into chaos than ever before. The truth was that Ozzy's relationship with alcohol and drugs had never truly disappeared after the Black Sabbath years. If anything, the pressure of rebuilding his career made the problem worse. Touring meant constant travel, constant celebration, and constant access to substances that kept the cycle spinning. Cocaine, alcohol, pills. They became part of the daily routine surrounding the band. At times, Ozzy himself admitted that entire periods of his life simply vanished from memory. Years later, he would say that large parts of the early 1980s felt like a blur he could barely remember. The tragedy of Randy Rhoads' death in 1982 left a deep emotional wound that never fully healed. Randy had been more than a guitarist. He had been the musical partner who helped bring Ozzy back to life after the Black Sabbath split. When the plane crash ended Rhoads' life at just 25 years old, Ozzy lost the one person who had helped stabilize his fragile comeback. The grief pushed him even further towards self-destruction. As the decade continued, Ozzy's reputation for unpredictable behavior grew. Stories spread to the press about bizarre incidents on tour and backstage. Some stories were exaggerated, others painfully true. Fans often laughed at the legend of the wild rock star. But behind those stories was a man increasingly losing control of his own life. The alcohol, in particular, began to dominate his behavior. The situation reached a frightening turning point in 1989. One night in Los Angeles, after drinking heavily throughout the evening, Ozzy entered a blackout state. According to later accounts, he approached his wife Sharon and calmly told her something chilling: "I've decided you have to die." Moments later, he attempted to strangle her inside their home. Sharon managed to escape and contact the police. Ozzy was arrested and taken to Los Angeles County Jail, charged with attempted murder. For the outside world, the incident was shocking even by rock and roll standards. The same man who had become famous for outrageous stage antics was now facing the possibility of destroying his own family. For Sharon, the moment forced an impossible decision. She could leave Ozzy and end the chaos permanently, or she could try to help him confront the addiction that had taken control of his life. Ozzy himself later described that night as one of the darkest moments he had ever faced. When he woke up in jail, he had almost no memory of what had happened. The reality of what he had done hit him with devastating force. It became clear that the destructive lifestyle surrounding him had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Rehabilitation became unavoidable. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ozzy entered multiple rehab programs, attempting to confront the addiction that had haunted him for years. Recovery was never simple. Like many long-term addicts, he struggled through cycles of progress and relapse. Each time he seemed to regain control, the temptations of fame and touring threatened to pull him back again. Yet during these difficult years, something important began to change. Sharon Osbourne gradually transformed from simply Ozzy's wife into the central force managing both his career and his survival. She enforced stricter structures around his work, limited access to destructive influences, and pushed him toward medical treatment whenever the situation demanded it. Their relationship remained volatile, but Sharon's determination created a fragile stability that had not existed before. At the same time, Ozzy's public image continued evolving in strange ways. The outrageous stories that once threatened to destroy his reputation began transforming into part of the mythology surrounding him. Fans saw him not just as a musician, but as a symbol of rock music's wildest extremes. A man who seemed permanently balanced between genius and collapse. The irony was that the darker his reputation became, the larger his legend grew. By the early 1990s, Ozzy was no longer just a successful solo artist. He had become a cultural figure whose name represented the rebellious spirit of heavy metal itself. Albums continued selling, tours continued attracting massive audiences, and a new generation of musicians openly cited him as an influence. Yet the internal battle was far from over. Ozzy's health was beginning to show the effects of decades of abuse. Years of alcohol, drugs, and relentless touring had taken a toll on both his body and his mind. The same lifestyle that had fueled the legend of the Prince of Darkness was slowly wearing him down. Many observers quietly believed that Ozzy's story would eventually end the same way as many other rock tragedies. Another headline about a legendary musician who pushed too far and never returned. But once again, Ozzy Osbourne would do something unexpected. Instead of disappearing into the long list of rock casualties, he would enter one of the strangest and most unlikely chapters of his life, a transformation that no one in the music industry could have predicted, because the man who had once terrified audiences as the Prince of Darkness was about to become something completely different, a global television personality. By the mid-1990s, Ozzy Osbourne had already survived more chaos than most rock stars experience in an entire lifetime. He had been fired from the band that made him famous, battled decades of addiction, lost one of his closest musical partners in a tragic accident, and nearly destroyed his own family during the darkest moments of his alcoholism. Yet, somehow, he was still standing. The question now was not whether Ozzy could survive another scandal. The real question was whether he could transform his life into something sustainable. The first step in that transformation came through a project that many people initially underestimated. In 1996, Sharon Osbourne launched a new touring festival called Ozzfest. At the time, heavy metal was going through a strange period. The rise of alternative rock and grunge had pushed many metal bands out of the mainstream spotlight. Sharon saw an opportunity to bring the genre back together on a massive stage. Ozzfest became a traveling festival built around Ozzy as the headlining icon, while introducing younger bands to global audiences. What began as an experimental idea quickly exploded into one of the most influential touring festivals in modern music. Every summer, thousands of fans gather across North America and Europe to see a lineup of metal acts sharing the same stage. Bands such as Slipknot, System of a Down, Korn, and Disturbed gained massive exposure through the festival. For Ozzy, Ozzfest became something more than just another tour. It allowed him to reinvent himself not only as a performer, but as a central figure guiding the next generation of heavy music. Yet the most unexpected transformation of Ozzy's public image was still waiting ahead. In 2002, MTV introduced a new reality television series called The Osbournes. The concept sounded almost absurd. Cameras would follow Ozzy, Sharon, and her children inside their own home, documenting the chaotic everyday life of one of rock music's most infamous families. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of seeing the terrifying Prince of Darkness that dominated heavy metal mythology, audiences discovered a completely different Ozzy. On television, he appeared confused, soft-spoken, and often hilariously out of place inside his own house. He wandered through rooms mumbling to himself, argued playfully with his children, and struggled to understand modern technology. The contrast between his stage persona and his domestic personality fascinated viewers. The show became an immediate cultural phenomenon. Millions of people tuned in every week to watch the Osbourne family. For many viewers, this was their first real introduction to Ozzy Osbourne. Instead of a frightening rock icon, they saw an aging musician who looked more like a bewildered grandfather trying to navigate everyday life. The program quickly became one of MTV's highest-rated shows, transforming Ozzy into a mainstream television celebrity. The success of the series changed Ozzy's public image forever. For decades, he'd been known primarily for outrageous stories, biting a bat on stage, wild backstage behavior, and the relentless chaos of rock and roll life. But the Osbournes revealed a completely different side of him, a family man who loved his wife and children, even if he often looked lost in the middle of his own household. In an unexpected twist, the Prince of Darkness had become strangely relatable. The show also introduced Ozzy to an entirely new generation. Teenagers who had never listened to Black Sabbath suddenly knew him as the funny, confused father on television. Meanwhile, longtime fans watched with a mixture of disbelief and admiration as the most unpredictable figure in metal somehow reinvented himself once again. By the early 2000s, Ozzy Osbourne had achieved something very few musicians ever accomplish. He had survived long enough to become a living legend, And perhaps even more surprising, he had done it by embracing a version of himself that no one in the music industry had ever expected to see. But while Ozzy's public life was entering a new phase of stability, time was slowly beginning to reveal the physical cost of the decades he had spent living on the edge. By the time the 2000s began to unfold, Ozzy Osbourne had already lived through several lives inside one career. He had been the troubled factory worker from Birmingham, the unpredictable frontman of Black Sabbath, the rock star fired from his own band, the chaotic solo performer who shocked audiences around the world, and now unexpectedly a mainstream television personality known by millions of viewers who had never attended a metal concert. Few musicians in modern history had managed to survive so many dramatic reinventions. Yet behind the strange twist of Ozzy's public life, his true legacy had already been firmly established inside the world of music. With Black Sabbath, Ozzy helped create the foundation of heavy metal itself. The band's early albums, particularly Black Sabbath 1970 and Paranoid 1970, introduced a darker sound that had rarely been heard in rock before. Tony Iommi's heavy guitar riffs, combined with Ozzy's haunting voice, created a style that would influence generations of musicians. Over the following decades, countless bands across metal, hard rock, and alternative music cited Black Sabbath as a direct inspiration. Ozzy's solo career added another chapter to that influence. Albums such as Blizzard of Ozz, Diary of a Madman, and later releases continued expanding the reach of his music. Songs like Crazy Train became permanent fixtures in rock culture, played on radio stations in stadiums and across generations of fans. What had once been considered controversial music in the 1970s gradually became part of the foundation of modern rock history. Recognition from the music industry eventually followed. In 2006, Black Sabbath was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, formally acknowledging the band's enormous impact on popular music. For Ozzy, the honor represented something deeply symbolic. Decades earlier, he had been a troubled young man struggling to escape factory life in Birmingham. Now he stood recognized as one of the pioneers of an entire genre. Beyond awards and sales numbers, Ozzy's influence extended into the culture surrounding rock music itself. His wild reputation, his survival through addiction, and his strange sense of humor turned him into a symbol of rock's rebellious spirit. The nickname Prince of Darkness became part of music mythology, yet fans also knew him as something more human, a man who repeatedly faced his own demons and somehow kept moving forward. Even in later years, as age and health issues began to slow him down, Ozzy continued recording music, appearing in public, and performing whenever possible. New generations of artists continue to credit him as a foundational influence, while older fans saw him as one of the last living links to the earliest days of heavy metal. After more than 5 decades in the spotlight, Ozzy Osbourne was no longer simply a rock star. He had become part of the history of the genre itself. And perhaps the most remarkable part of that history was that the man who had once seemed destined to burn out quickly had managed to outlast almost everyone's expectations. But in the end, Ozzy's story was never just about music. It was about survival. If someone had looked at Ozzy Osbourne in 1979, the story would have seemed finished. A singer fired from his own band, drowning in alcohol and drugs, drifting through a life that appeared completely out of control. In the brutal history of rock music, stories like that rarely ended well. Many artists who lived the same way never made it out alive. And yet Ozzy Osbourne did. The boy who once struggled in school, the factory worker from industrial Birmingham, somehow became the voice of one of the most influential bands in music history. When that band collapsed around him, he rebuilt himself through a solo career that many people believed was impossible. When addiction nearly destroyed his family, he faced consequences that forced him to confront the darkest parts of his life. And when age and time threatened to push him out of the spotlight, he reinvented himself in ways no one expected. Few musicians have lived through so many transformations. The legend The Prince of Darkness often focuses on the shocking stories, the bad on stage, the chaos of rock tours, the headlines that followed him for decades. But behind those moments was something far more unusual. A man who repeatedly stood on the edge of collapse and somehow found a way to step back. In the end, Ozzy Osbourne's life is not just a story about fame or music. It is a story about endurance. Because in an industry where so many icons burned out too fast, The most unbelievable part of Ozzy's journey may simply be this. He survived long enough to become a legend,